Good evening, everybody. Doggone. I'm gonna go more about pawn chains and freaking when to do an attack and when to have counterplay and the mechanics of that. So I got 3 games from doggone freaking what's it called, chessgame.com, or older database for the more 19th century, later 19th century, maybe earliest 20th century. And let's get straight to it. And then let's see, this. V5, okay. And this is a Masters game. Okay, 1974, 08, round 5, 1-0. My God, cut that quick. 9th World Chess Championship with over 6 World Chess Champions, Soviet teammate cut, Moscow, USSR. Alright, check. Now let's turn off the evaluation just to make sure I can take this off. And then we'll turn it back on the appropriate chances so we can evaluate. Okay. So let's go and start with this. Basically, going to start off and go into focus on the pawn chains, and let's read the intro just to make sure I don't get a bunch of nothing. This is going to be a technical overview. This is the mechanic of pawn chains and counterplay. A pawn chain is the structural foundation of a chess game. It dictates what good pieces are good or bad, quote unquote. It provides a natural guide for when to launch an attack. The directional rule is a pawn chain is usually points toward a specific side of the board, king or queen side. You should generally attack in the direction of the pawn chain's points, or the lead pawn. And the weakest pawn is the base of the pawn chain, as it is where you possess a space advantage. It's most likely. Attacking the base is the most effective way to attack its root. Put pressure the pawn in the back. The base falls and the structure collapses. And timing the break is as counterplay is triggered when the opponent begins to fly flank attack onto the pawn chain. You must strike in the center of their chain to create the distraction or open the gates for minor pieces and major pieces. Running go into game analytics and present scripts. What happens when the magician or Berga meets the Iron Tiger? I like to call it. Most players fear Passant, the 9th World Chess Championship's defense, but we all know this season while he is the target. Today we're going to analyze how a single pawn push into a solid change of how it roll. I believe this is correct, right? This is the correct game. And yeah, bishop f1, check this. And let's go. We go with the ready's opening. Knight f3. Pawn to g6 is just on field cutting on the king side. Pawn to e4, fighting for the light squares. The knight's fighting for the dark squares. Pawn and knight, one piece is developed out early, and black is most likely to play here, or gonna potentially try to fight for the light squares, or develop their knight this way, or even a lot of different moves. Well, let's continue. Pawn to e4, bishop g7, so either or, put the bishop on the Biancano, relatively pins this pawn to the rook. And the king is one more minor piece developed on the king side of the castle. So one minor piece is developed, one minor piece is developed, one pawn in the center, and one isn't, no pawn in the centers. So position would be slightly better for white. Pawn d4, immediately gaining the center. They're saying, hey, if you're not going to take the center, I'm going to take the classical advantage. Now taking all 4 of these squares to grip. The knight grips this square, and it's a pretty solid setup. So goes pawn to d6, as explained, but in the opposite format now. Not fighting for the light squares, but fighting for the dark squares. Why? Because this pawn is defended, however, it needs to stop. It's practically fighting for the dark squares now, and potentially supporting a pawn push on the e-pawn. In knight to c3, simply interluding the knights, defending one another. Knight to f6, developing the knight, putting pressure on this pawn, putting pressure on these light squares too. So you see how masters fight for the color complexity of squares, and putting space in the center, and putting pawns to fight for a certain position of squares, or certain positions of, if the knight is on a dark square, guards light squares, and vice versa. Knight on a dark square, guards light squares. So everything is doing something and fighting for a color complexity. And now, I would say that white has a space advantage and has a tempo of development. Very simple. or equal, technically equal, because this bishop is not playing on granite, but potentially X-raying and putting pressure on this pawn, and this knight is simply putting pressure on this pawn, so black is getting the minor pieces and more hyper-mounted. Here's some theory of putting pressure on the center with pieces and slowly chipping away like a nostalgic of good death by 1,000 cuts. Then goes to little castles, knight into freaking d6, catching up on development, and then pawn boot, and then the pawn push to d6. Now, Bedouin is making a commitment, fighting for the light squares, restricting this bishop from getting out, and simply potentially creating a target with this pawn, but this light square bishop can add to the defense, the queen and the rook can slide over, but practically saying, I'm going to take full space if you're not going to fight for it with your pawns. So the knight undevelops itself and goes back. Opponent immediately goes rook to e1. Why? Supporting the pawn base and chain, saying, okay, I have a space advantage, now I want to use my rook in a more defensive manner to protect the pawn. Then immediately goes and strikes and offers the capture of en passant, but also closes out the games and makes this bishop really good. Even though this piece is parallelly defending this relative pin, it is a good idea, and potentially could provoke h3, which could become a hook, or which could potentially make sort of hook pawns and potential in the future. So look at the pawn chain though. It is about move 8. The white's pawns is pushing towards the queen side. Black's pawn are pushing towards the king side. So what is black's main objective? To attack. Knight go here, queen slide to frickin' h4 to remove this guard, this important knight to defend that's defending this dark square pawn. To get a rook lift, to potentially get a rook lift, to shove out some hook pawns, push, all, and making the game plan very clear. So, so white decides to capture en passant. Why? To continuously have a backup on the light squares, but also very simply. Why did white take? I gotta think about this. Okay. Oh, I see. To slowly chip away the king's safety. I see. The king at the king's safety, even though it helps to defend the knight, and the bishop could develop to a decently better square. It wouldn't really be doing too much, and this knight could potentially capture an outpost because bishop here, not a freaking. Let's see. Let's continue. Yep, and the bishop takes. Bishop at 4, putting pressure on this pawn and bringing another minor piece in the game. Very simply, firing the light squares. And these pawns are opposite each other. So what are these pawns doing? They're fighting for the opposite color complex. Black for black, white for white. And then pawn for h6, eventually paying a hook pawn and restricting based on this bishop developing on its best square. This bishop is binding on granite and potentially could get tempo on soon. Like potentially here, maybe freaking here. As an example, to give the queen some development, but the guard and the objective and the key defender in white's position is this knight on f3. That's the key. This defender is your target. And yes, white is defending it so well with pawn, queen, and a freaking bishop, light square bishop. Now let's turn on the evaluation and look at it. I'm going to say that I was going to assume white is slightly better because of the defense of the knight, and there's potential weakness on now h7 because of the pawn push, even though it restricts the bishop and black is slightly behind, but still can gain an advantage if they could utilize their resources correctly. So, that said, white goes knight to d4, basically offering to take off one of the bishop on a good diagonal, offering basically offering a trade, and to create leave no pawn on the f file, which the rook would defend the knight, but potentially trading off this good bishop for this undefended knight. Even though the queen defends it, it has an active role protecting the bishop on the battery of the d diagonal. So, bishop d7, saying I'm not going to allow my good bishop to be traded, my knight's going to defend the bishop, and that's why black even undeveloped the knight on the freaking b8 from white's point of view. Queen d2, very simply stepping out of the battery, but now, where's my mouse? Okay, right here, and simply defending everything, and playing more of a defensive role. Defend, and putting itself on a different battery, now on the dark square battery. Then opponent immediately goes king to h7 to add supporting chances to this pawn. Now, basically 1, 2, 3, and there's 1, 2. So, or 1, 2, 1, 2. So equal on attackers, equal on defenders, and the material value of the trade wouldn't make any sense. Freaking on the e5, putting pressure on this knight and trying to open the positions and open up the line for the rook on the e file. D takes e5. Now this pawn could potentially become isolated, and this square is on d5. Where is my mouse? Holy crap. It's weak, and there's just little subtle key square targets for black, for white for now. D takes. Freaking bishop takes, putting pressure on the knight, relatively pinning the knight to the bishop. Knight to e4, offering a bishop trade. And also then tries to wait. And then bishop takes e5. After this move, the game finishes. So I'm gonna go on to this. Move 7 d5 was a game spacing move. e5 was a central break for heavy pieces, yes. And then g5 checks. Alright, this is not it. No, this is not it. This is a different game, I think. Alright, yeah, so like bishop takes, knight takes, bishop takes. Counter strikes the bishop slides back. Right. And then queen goes to create a battery on the freaking white squares. Bishop to there. Putting pressure on the freaking f pawn to basically my piece is taking the targets. Knight to g5 shattering king's safety and pawn trackers, and also defend it twice. But then knight with the queen. Pawn takes, knight takes, check, kick steps out the way. Queen slides in, threatening the bishop to. And putting a lot of pressure on the f7 pawn. Knight defends the rook. Rook takes, sacrifices the rook to continuously remove defenders, deflect the bishop from the f7 square, and to potentially try to get a force mate. So, what the fuck? I took the piece off the board. Bishop gets deflected, bishop sacrifice. And then black resigns. Why? Because the rook takes, it's gonna be most likely mate. Bishop f7 check. Takes yes, this is correct. Even though there's not a force mate, it's such an advantage for like outside sacrificing the bishop and deflecting his pin pawn to the king. So let's say if holy Christ, this is so annoying. Hey, bishop takes, and let's say rook takes, right? Which would be right? It would be such a two options. You can either go for an absolute pin to stop push or something, or just simply take the rook for check. You take the rook for check. Okay. So slow. Where's my mouse? Alright. What the fuck? I just see mate. Yeah, like this queen takes. Queen takes rook on the 7th rank, and pawn takes, bishop is attacked only by the king. Alright, let's go to the next scene and let us summarize. Okay. So, now, let's find out, how did he not tell me to attack? He understood the pawn advantage of James the king. The pieces are actually in town. There's petrol. 6 sort of tips in, being the knight. which is a rook 13, e5, 6 lines on the so the pawn break and the chain forms for the king. When this counterplay is when you're being squeezed. It's not comfortable range, and then the next game, back wheeler, the central pressure was 2-5, and use an exchange sacrifice, or sacrifice the exchange for kid d6 to change the character of the game. Now, we're gonna have to go and read about studying understanding pawn chains. A pawn chain consists of 2 or more pawns, same color, diagonally linked, fighting for the same color. Strong structures like skeletons position. They determine and give the opponent to see what pieces, where your pieces should be, and to help understand how can I defend from your pieces want to go here. How do I fight for those squares and what I should have? Or your tactics and regarding to the favor of those squares or favor of material, etc., etc. So key concepts are this: the base, the head, and the world director. The pawn at the very back of the chain is structurally foundational. It's the most defended pawn you need, and the most important pawn to keep you not getting sacrificed for or captured, and the head is the furthest pawn. So base, head, base, head, base, head. In the world direction is generally you should attack. In the king's direction of the pawn chain, if the pawn pushes the king down, your space advantage and attacking prospects are there. If it's on the queen side, then you go for endgame and counterplay, and making for an expansion on the queen side, and making for sort of an attack there, even though it won't be directly at the king. So let's analyze this breakthrough. Using the games that were provided as I went through, the elite players manipulated these structures to create winning attacks with defensive masterpieces. As you saw, d5 on move 7, c5 critical breakthrough, stops central tension open line for all his major and minor pieces, and the town sacrifices check knight e5 check to sacrifice that pawn, the critical defender of the king. When a pawn chain gives you a space advantage like white d5, look for ways to use it to pivot towards the enemy king. This is in a positional round, counterplay, and endgame. They attack opposite. Now let's go to it. Excuse me. Now let's do our format again. Let's go frickin' computer now. So let's move off and engage off on everything off so we can go and run this together. Okay, so rook endgame and basically draw. Okay, but practically draw by convertively pretty hard to win. Okay, so we're gonna look from the opposite perspective now of black. So white goes for a queen's pawn opening, as you see, is just simply offering potentials to the queen gambit. Potentially, I put a knight here, go for more principally developing its knight, developing the opposite knight, potentially developing the bishop, pushing off the center. Certainly, basically 5 options. So pawn to d4, knight to f6, the Indians game. Freaking basically is the most flexible way, fighting for the light squares, pawn bite for the dark squares. Pawn to c4, putting the queen's gambit. Pawn to e6, declining the gambit, even though this pawn is not matching each other, but fighting for the light squares too. Freaking knight to c3, fighting for the light squares, supporting what's it called, the freaking potential pawn thrust on the e pawn forward. And then freaking bishop b4, relative, absolutely pinning the dark square bishop, dark square knight to the king. Pawn to e3. Oh wait, I got to do the evaluation. Okay. Let's go delete this. Turn it off. And then castles. Freaking bishop d3, developing the bishop to it's almost that square. Because they would usually want to always go here, but it would be biting on granite and the pawn blocks it. So the bishop gets access to the diagonal and defends the light square pawn. And then pawn d5, immediately striking the center, offering trying to open up position, to open up the queen, to get access for this bishop and a beautiful diagonal, to get top on the queen potentially. So, c takes, d takes, remember bishop open on light square, beat in. Well, I would say technically this bishop may not be technically developed, but I would say in my opinion it's developed because it's taking this entire diagonal, and only white is fighting for this one square, and fighting for these squares. So, freaking, practically saying is this bishop is 10 times better than this just white controls this square, and it controls all these squares here. 1, 2, 3, and bishop develops only controls this one square. So it has 2 spaces of controlled squares more than one. So 2 to 1 by conclusion is better. So knight to e2, defending the knight and defending the pin piece. Knight c6, adding a defender to the pinning piece. Castles, knight rerouting to potentially go to g6. Pawn at f3, pushing the pawn forward and trying to undermine this pawn chain with this pawn push, potentially. Knight to g6, rerouting the knight, bishop c2, working on a battery with the queen, and trying to basically get this vector of these squares to fight for. Then pawn to c6. Now this is the pawn chain, and what is black's goal? Is to attack the king. What is white's goal? Is to go to the queen side and create counterplay. King to h1, stepping out of King h1 is just simply defending both pawns and moving it onto the light square, because this light square bishop isn't developed as much, so the king has more safe on the light square. Freaking pawn bishop e6, defending the pawn chain, developing the bishop. a3, kicking out the bishop. Bishop slides back to d6, defended by the queen. Pawn to h3, creating a weakness on the dark squares, and the bishop pair is raising an insurmountable amount of pressure. Freaking knight h5, trying to take advantage of the dark square weaknesses, because this pawn only fights for this dark square. And these knights both to fight for it, this bishop fights for it, and it's a hypermodernism of 3 to 1, and this pawn only fights, or 3 to 2, technically. So that square is occupied by black for now, without being occupied. Literally. Pawn e4, striking at black's pawn chain, saying, I'm going to try to nullify your attack. Pawn takes, the rook opened up, so relatively pins the f-pawn to the rook. Then knight g3, forking the king and the rook. Knight takes, bishop takes, forcing a trade in the knight and the bishop. Bishop goes to e3, fighting for these diagonals, and sending directly towards the bishop so it can never move without hanging itself. Technically, if it wants to go here, but no reason to. Defending the squares, fighting for squares of the dark. Bishop c7, rerouting to the queen's battery. Pawn e5, gaining more square footing, making this bishop bite on granite. Bishop e6, queen d2, queen d7, opposite color batteries. Rook to f3, rook lift. Rook to a8, a8, pressure on this pawn. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So equal amount of attackers on this f pawn, the d pawn. This is the whole practically of the game. And queen to c8, ruining itself and putting more pressure on this defending this undefended pawn. Meaning just defending this pawn. I did that. So queen f2. Doing sort of the opposite, creating a battery, extra-ranging defense of the d pawn. Rook b7, rook lifting, trying to go for a maneuver of the rook standing up to defend. Rook g3, rook e3, putting pressure on the knight. Bishop to d8, rerouting the bishop to the defense of the king. Bishop g5, saying, hey, I want to trade off defenders of the king and get more pressure. Bishop takes, rook takes, queen d8, queen steps up to defend, squeezing its way slowly to the king. Queen e7, fighting for the dark squares, because there's the same color bishops, and minor piece, freaking rook and queen, and there's pawn majority on the queen side. And white's pawn structure on the king side is way better than, black's pawn structure is way better on the king side, because all the pawns are on home base. The only potential weaknesses are this diagonal, but this pawn is making these squares very hard for white to really take advantage of. At e4. Adding another piece to the attack. Bishop pawn to d6, fighting for the queen's side light squares and defending, fighting for these squares. queenside counterplay that white may want to do. Rook L left, relative deepening the pawn. And rook to f8, fighting for the backwards pawn now, because this pawn is technically backwards and isolated. This pawn is forced to defend this pawn, and this pawn is only defended by the queen. So 1-2 against 1-2. Could technically be captured, but no reason for it right now. Knight to d6, interference, putting a knight in a good outpost, and putting a knight in a very good outpost. And then rook takes, exchange, sacrifice the exchange, and say I'm going to sacrifice my rook for a minor piece to abuse the pressure on this isolated pawn. These pawns, technically these little bits sort of pawn islands. This is the only really pawn island for now, but at the same point, rook g3, adding defense to the third rank, and coordinating together, and having multiple open files against the king. Queen d7, putting a battery on the d file against the pawn. Rook defends. Knight puts a knight reaver is gonna try to. The right is the knight trying to reroute itself, put the more defense on the light square on the d file. On freaking d5, point d6. I don't understand why that happened. Now becomes an absolute pin. And d pawn offering a bishop trade. Rook defensive bishop. Pawn pushes to h5. And now let us continue. So small advantage means positional moves, and improving moves. Big advantage means attack, I like to say, in simple points. So pawn to b4, putting pressure, trying to create counterplay for white, as for white's goal. Bishop takes, and then rook takes. Knight's undefended, so knight needs to reunite and put pressure on the b4 pawn, and put it on a good outpost. To the e8 check. King steps on the way, now offering a queen trade, because white's pawn structure is not accepting a queen trade, because there's no reason for it. Rook g1, and then now accepting the queen trade because there's not as much as a battery on the e file. Rook takes, knight f4, and gaining another beautiful potential outpost, activating the knight, and the rook is even on the 8th link that has no targets and may be able to get behind the pawns. However, the rook is x-raying and defending almost all 1, 2, 3 out of the 3, so 3 out of 6, 50% of defends that pawn undefended, and knight now attacks the rook. Rook takes, what was it called? Rook takes back, and then rook c2, forcing offering a trade, but black hits counter check. King h2, knight d4, rook c1, offering a trade of rooks. Wait, the fuck? And then go back. Holy crap! Let's go h5. And then finally go back. I'm tired. We'll finish this video after this. And then simply rook c8, e2, for king to trade the pawns to captures. Rook takes the unprotected pawn. Rook takes the unprotected pawn. Rook to c1, rook c1 to c2. Freaking look at those, still the basis of the pawn chains. Observe how the B and A pawns are still pointing towards the king, and whites are now still pointing towards the queen, towards the king, but the king is not directly on the diagonal, and there's not so much attacking pieces to even do it. So king h2, defending all the pawns. Let's just push. 2.0 advantage, so slowly, almost enough of a big enough advantage to convert into a winning endgame. Pawn h4, checking the king. King goes out the way. Knight goes to e2, attacking the rook. Rook takes the open b file. Rook d5, centralizing the rook. King goes back h2, defending. Rook f5, taking another semi-open f file. Rook to ab7, stacking on the b file battery. Rook defending the f pawn. Rook going to f4, defending the 2 pawn islands, potentially defending the 2 pawn islands. As white has 1 pawn island, black has 2 pawn islands, and the king is absolutely, the last pawn's absolutely pinned. Attacking white's pawn island. Knight to g, attacking the rook. Rook goes to force the knight out the way. Knight takes rook, rook takes, simplifying to a king and pawn endgame, minor pieces removed, but this pawn island and this A-pass pawn makes practically white for basically white in a complicated position. Rook b3, defending the pawn, move. Kings are slowly getting activated now. Pawn chain 3-2. Kingside majority 1-1. Rook is restricting the freaking. The reason why black is winning is because the rook is restricting the king, and the king is going to get centralized first. The black king, if you're safe, and that's it. And the pawn majority of 2-3. Rook c4. King z3. Freaking rook c5, giving the king a potential chance to centralize, but wants to defend the pawn island on c5. Pawn e4. Rook f5, king defends, king steps aside, to f2, getting behind the pawn chain, trying to create a 3-1 pawn majority, g3, pawn takes, rook takes, rook goes and takes the b file, now it's a 2-1 majority, and then white resigns because of the 2-1 majority and the rook activity, and the king is still just not able to really make progress as easily. So, let's go and beat our nose. This is Sokol versus Anderson in 1899, the battle of hanging pawns and central control. Counterplay is the response to the opponent's pressure. You gotta know what time it is to see counterplay. The opponent is overextended, the pawn team is too advanced and the base becomes weak, lines opening towards the king create a direct threat elsewhere. Usually the center or opposite wing to distract them, sort of deflecting. Race is restricted. If you can't look for a pawn like a5 or e5 or c5 to liberate your pieces, your minor image pieces. The pawn chain is a structural foundation, as we said, which pieces are good or bad in relative value, when to launch an attack, and engineer style of play. Understanding structures will allow higher accuracy and long-range calculation. The direction of the pawn is usually pointing again, attacking the base, breakthroughs, and now forcing moves and a logical simplification. When a position is structurally defined, calculation becomes more linear. To maintain absolute precision, focus on forcing moves. Once again, checks, captures, direct threats. Simplification is key. Reducing number of pieces to classify structural advantages of the pawn chain, reduce noise and non-attention like logic in the passive pawn, for your minor piece, or pawn majorities, or pawn chains pushes, or attacks, whatever. In champion position, the structure is semi-fixed, meaning you can calculate deeper in the future if the skeleton on the board is unlikely to change quickly. And you can calculate longer and more accurate, using your head or base as the focal points of fortune sequences. If your opponent must respond to a check or a capture, you control the tempo of the transition. And then we're going to go for this for the next game, for the end of this game. Thank you guys. And we're going to go for this. So now let's go with this. Let's go with this. Check off, right? And then counterplay is always a check play. Sometimes a slow, agonizing swing. Rudolf Anderson is the master of visual counterplays. He absorbs white central pressure and converts a tiny structural lead into a full point. As you saw, counterplay is your response to pressure. Knowing when to see counterplays, overextension, king safety, and the squeeze. And these are the PGNs. Thank you guys for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and continue to watch this content and absorb it. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen and ladies. Out.
So let America be victorious forevermore. Honor the fallen.